how to succeed at them. Job interviews are pretty daunting, especially if you're fairly new to them as well. This session hopefully will give you a few tips on how to succeed, and also an insight on things to expect. I've been joined by this wonderful panel today to discuss these topics. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. And could I start with you, please, Lucy?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Tom. I'm Lucy. I'm Director of Development, Director of Partnerships, actually, at the Museum of the Home. Before that, I was Director of Development at the British Council, and I've been at Serpentine Galleries, Macmillan National Trust. I've had some quite big teams in some of those roles, so I've done lots of interviews as an interviewer, as well as an interviewee. And also, I just thought of this now, actually, while you were chatting. For the first half of my career, I was a journalist, so I've done lots of interviews of footballers to politicians as well. Not that that's hugely relevant, but it does involve trying to get information out of people.
Yeah, I can see how that could be an interesting place in which to develop skills, certainly. Laura Southall, please.
Yeah, there's two Lauras. Apologies, everyone, in advance. That's what you get when you work in museums, Lauras and Sarahs. So I am Laura Southall. I'm Head of Learning at the Science Museum. I've only been there for a very short amount of time, about 6 months. Before that, I have worked at Pallant House Gallery, the V&A, the Imperial War Museum, the RIBA, numerous places. And so, as you can imagine, have had lots of interviews. Got a bit of a sort of museum bingo card of interviews. Definitely want to put myself out there. So I've had lots of interviews, but also have conducted quite a few interviews as well. So hopefully we'll have something useful to say.
Thank you very much. James Etherington, please.
Hi, yes, my name is James Etherington. I'm the Director of Kiplin Hall and Gardens, a historic house and registered museum, accredited museum, sorry, in North Yorkshire. I've also been on both sides of the table of interviews quite excessively. I've worked at the RAF Museum in London, the Ashmolean Museum, Ripon Museums, and I've sat in on about, I think, led about 30 interviewing processes and had about 30 myself as well.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know you were at the RAF Museum, James. That's where I work as well, which I forgot to say in my introduction. I'm based at the Cosford site in the Midlands, though. Sarah, how about you, please?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm Head of Heritage Learning at Carlisle Cathedral. Before working there, I've worked around a lot of the museums in Cumbria. I've worked my way around. I've had a lot of interviews. I've had a lot of really bad interviews. I feel like I could help quite a lot with when things go wrong at the start. When I was first starting out, just after doing my Masters, I went through, I think, about 6 or 7 interviews in the space of 2 months. Most of them I did not get. So I've learned a lot from that. So it's a lot of hard experiences has got me to where I am.
I think something we want to touch later on in the session is that no interview is ever a truly wasted experience, no matter how badly it seems at the time. Laura Crossley, please.
Hello, I'm Laura. I'm Head of Content at the National Football Museum in Manchester. Like the other panellists, I've been on both sides of the table lots and lots of times for both in-house and freelance jobs. Before working at the Football Museum, I was at the National Trust, the History of Science Museum in Oxford, a couple of independent trusts and museums, and I also spent 8 years as a freelance museums consultant, which involves lots of interviews all the time. So I think there was an 11-week period last year where I had an interview a week for 11 weeks. So yeah, hopefully I can bring experience on both sides of the table, but as said, for freelance as well as in-house jobs.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. So we're going to start off with a series of questions just to get discussion going. So my first one is, what questions can you expect to come up at an interview? And is there a way to predict them? So I'm going to start with Lucy, please.
Sure. I mean, I think there really is a way to predict them, but I'd say rather than trying to predict them, I would always ask. And when you get your letter inviting for interview, I would respond. Hopefully, they should tell you lots in that letter, but not all of them do. So I'd certainly be asking who is interviewing you. And then I would ask them what type of what's the format of the interview? Will the questions be competency based, experience based? How will they be framing them? And make sure that you're aware. And then I'm sure we'll all talk in this answer about the types of questions that can come up as that. But one of the things, ones I wanted to pull out is that you're often asked to talk through your CV, or talk through why you're right, talk through your experiences as to why you're right. And actually, the last thing an interviewer actually wants is for you to talk through your CV. They've read it. They don't want you to sit there and go, in 1994, I did this. Well, actually, no one else is old enough probably to go back that far. It's just aged me there somewhat. But, you know, in 2014, I did this for this long. What they actually want to know is how those experiences relate to what they've put on the JD as the essential skills. So I would say absolutely don't just sit and do a chronological talk through of your CV or experiences. If possible, try and pull out the key themes and not do it chronologically, but do it sort of thematically, and take in notes to follow this on. For me personally, I was, as I mentioned, I was a journalist for quite a number of years. Then I ended up running my own business in France for a while, and then going into heritage with the National Trust. And when I first started thinking about interviews, I was like, oh my God, this makes no sense. They're going to think, who is this girl? She's jumped about all these different careers and areas. And of course, actually, that can be quite common these days, and especially as you get a bit older. So for me, I had to think, well, what ties all these things together? What is it amongst my skills and what I can bring that ties what looks like three quite disparate career paths together? And for me, it was storytelling and that kind of search for an audience and a USP that links journalism, running a business, and philanthropy. So I always start with that kind of thing for me. You know, as you can see from my previous experiences, it might look disjointed, but actually what pulls it together is this idea, and use that as a starting point. I'll let the others take over.
I think that's very interesting, especially about asking for as much information up front, which is not something I always have felt I've had the confidence to do. But knowing it's worked for you, I think moving forward, that's something I'll take on. And also talking through your CV in a more enlightened way is definitely a question that I've found come up time and time again, as well as why do you want the job is another classic. But I'm wondering if anybody else, Laura Southall, I see you raising your hand.
I'm waving. Yeah, I was just going to touch on that sort of why do you want the job question. The amount of interviews I've been in where people just have not prepared for that. That is your sort of classic one. And even if you don't get asked that directly, it might come out in another answer, it might come out in another question. And when I'm preparing for that, I try and think about why I want the job for me, so my own personal development and all of those, you know, reasons. Oh, it's my dream job and everything. Don't be too gushing would probably be a starting point, but there's nothing wrong with saying that you really want the job, you've always wanted to work there. If that's the truth, then say it. But I think also I try and prepare why I would be good in the job as well. I think that's always a nice marriage of, you know, you don't want to hear as an interviewer, yeah, just why I want the job, it's going to be great for me. You want to hear, I think I'm going to be good in this job because I've got this experience to bring, I've got this skills, and it seems to me from the work that you've been doing, or, you know, what this said on the JD, that this would be really valuable. So I try and prepare a bit of a pitch about myself as well. And the other thing that I always try and prepare, and I quite like this part, so I usually do this first, I try and prepare just half an hour to look at work not only in that organisation but work in that field in other organisations, because quite a common question is usually you know, what other things in the sector have you seen that interest you or that you'd like to bring to this job, or, you know, what are the trends in, I don't know, museum learning, museum development, whatever. And I think just having, as I say, that's quite a nice bit for me to prep, because it's just half an hour and you just jot down on a bit of paper things that you've seen, exhibitions that you've seen that you loved. If you can have some examples of how you've brought practice from elsewhere into your practice, excellent, talk about those. But if it's just you've seen something and in this job you might like to reference that or talk about that, then then that's great. And I remember I got caught out once in my very first interview for a exhibitions job. Someone said, tell me about an exhibition that you'd seen that you loved, and I hadn't prepared. You know, I just went totally blank and said something about an exhibition that I'd seen at that organisation, which is never, I mean, it's fine, isn't it? But it's never the best example, you know, that's a bit obvious. So I always, since that moment of awkwardness, I always have a little think about other places and see if I can weave that in somewhere.
Yeah, excellent.
I'll just say to that, Laura, I was asked about a good theatre production I'd seen in the last year, which was a very niche question. It wasn't a theatre job I was going for. And I'd been on maternity leave, and it was my first role back, and all I could think of was sort of monkey music and sensory classes. And I thought, everything that I've done culturally the last year has been, you know, with a babe in arms. And then I suddenly kind of had this little moment, and they asked me about the director, but that's not a normal museum. That's not a normal interview question. That was one of the curveballs. They'll come up later.
James, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, just I would agree with everything everyone said, but I would also go back to the job description or role profile, try and pick out words on there. So from our most recent example, we specifically asked for knowledge of spectrum, but we didn't specifically say in the interview question, tell us about spectrum. We asked something about collections development, and we were expecting to hear spectrum because we'd specifically mentioned it in the role profile. And you largely pick out probably about 90% of the questions. If there's a specification about education, you'll probably get an education question. If there's a specification about object handling, you might get an object handling question. So you can probably predict and prepare answers. You won't get them all right, but you can get most of them right just from the job description, especially if they're doing good recruitment where they're giving you all that kind of information up front.
I would definitely agree with that, and I think 90% is kind of spot on there as well. I think also look at the job description as well as the personal specification, because there may be things hidden in that don't make it to the spec, but which they might ask about anyway. Sarah?
Well, I would say if you are starting out and there's a good chance you're going to have a lot of interviews in short periods of time, is when you've put a lot of effort into preparing for one interview, you've done all the hard work for every future interview. So I created a document and I thought of every possible question that they could think and ask me. And then aside it, I put evidence. So you know how to answer questions, but in the nerves of being an interview, sometimes you forget to actually give the evidence, and it's the evidence normally that will pick you above someone else. So if you have all these lists of questions, they're going to ask you how you work well under pressure, when you've worked in a team, when you've shown initiative, what are your strengths, all these different questions. They'll word it differently. They'll word it to fit in with their organisation, but they are essentially a lot of the time asking the same questions. So if you've got this document that can help you, that just takes the pressure off, that you know certain questions come up, you've got evidence. It doesn't have to be from a museum job. If it's experience, whether it's volunteering or something completely separate. As long as you've got evidence, then it just makes your answer that bit better.
I think that's also equally true for writing covering letters, that if you've got an evidence example to cover something like communication skills, then you can use that time and time again. Laura Crossley.
I think also be prepared for the things that you're not as confident on. So, you know, if you've got a big gap in your CV, have a response for why that is, because you'll probably be asked about that. If you've left a job at, you know, short notice, there could be lots of reasons why you've done that, but it could be something the interviewer picks up on. And you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're having to think on your feet if it's potentially a difficult topic to talk about. I think also with the job description, I totally agree with what everyone said. Partly the interviewer is trying to find out, like, do they understand what this job is? And so I think it is really important to reflect that language back, so the interviewer can be really confident that you have an understanding of the job that you've gone for, and also how you are the best person for that job, because everyone who's got to interview stage has met the basic criteria. And then it's, you know, they're looking for that little extra, that little something, whether it's, you know, real enthusiasm for the job or you're reflecting the language back to them. That's how you kind of become the candidate, I think, who gets the job in the end.
I think reflecting language back is a really good thing to do, because it shows that you're sort of in tune with the organisation's aims and ways of working. So I definitely recommend that, again, for covering letters as well as for interviews. I would like to raise the topic of tests now, because a lot of interviews have a test element, and often it's filled me with dread, knowing that that's coming up. And I think especially that was true earlier on in my career when I hadn't had much experience, so I didn't know what sort of thing was going to come up. So have any of you got examples of particular tests that you've experienced? Or set, indeed, as interviewers?
I'll go first quickly.
Yes,
I
please,
hate
Sarah.
tests. Working in museum learning, there is often here's some random objects on the table, pick one up and talk to us about it, and that fills me with dread. You know, in my job I can talk to 40 kids that are 6 years old. They're looking at me blankly as I try and explain World War II or something, and I'm fine with that. But in an interview, you've got to remember it's also not a natural situation, so it's okay if you feel uncomfortable. It's more, if you know you're not going to do very well in this section, it's highlighting that you're aware of that. You know, make a bit of a joke of it, make the interviewers aware that you are just finding that a little bit uncomfortable. When it comes to preparing things for like presentations, if they've already told you what, say, they're going to ask, try and really focus what they're asking. I am really bad for being told to do a 5-minute presentation and spending days on it and then getting into the interview and saying everything, and then they're going, yep, good, moving on, and I'm like, oh, I've just stressed over that for so long. So really just try and focus on the key things they would want to hear from you.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what Lucy opened with as well. Try and interrogate them as far as possible and get as much information from them up front, because you never know what they're willing to divulge. So always ask. Does anybody else have any examples? Laura Crossley.
Yeah, I would say firstly, if it is presentations that if it's a test that you know about, I always see that as a good thing, because it means that probably the first thing that you're going to do in your interview, you actually know, and you've had time to prepare yourself for it. So I do put loads of work into presentations, doing lots of research and practicing a lot and making sure I'm really confident with what I'm saying. And I'm still very nervous at the start of an interview, but it's just something that you actually have a bit of control of in an interview. So make sure that you put the work in to really prepare for that. I once had a test, and I don't think any of us like tests. I once had a test where I had to write a press release in 15 minutes about a topic I'd not been told about before, and it wasn't even a specialist marketing job. That marketing was just a very small part of the job, so it wasn't what I was expecting at all in a test. But I always just tell myself at the start of tests, everyone is feeling the same. No one is going, woohoo, I'm going to do a test now. Can't wait for this. Really excited for the next 20 minutes of my life to be about a test. And I think the main thing actually is getting through it. I remember once doing a test for a job way before my museum career, which was an admin job. And I found it really, really difficult. But they said to me at the end, there were only 2 candidates who just got through it and not kind of given up halfway through because it was really hard. And I understand that impulse to think, oh, I just can't do this. But I think just really try and remain calm. Remember that no one is going to perform perfectly in a test where you don't know what's going to happen. So the interviewer isn't looking for perfection. They're just looking for someone who'll give it the best shot and go for it. And then hopefully they'll give you a chance in your interview to talk through the test as well. So you can talk about the things that you might, have done better next time. But yeah, I think just try, it's hard in an interview situation, but trying to remain as calm as possible and remembering it is the same for everyone. You just got to get through it and, it will all be fine. It will all be fine.
Everybody gets nervous. Laura Southall.
It's really terrifying. I don't know if anyone's been in this situation where they could sort of put you in a little office all on your own somewhere where you've never been before. I remember there was, I won't name names, but it was some sort of large castle. I felt like I was in like a little turret on my own, and I'd been given this ridiculous budget spreadsheet that I had to make sense of. It's terrifying. It's really not very nice. So we've all been there. Or they sit you in an office with other people. Oh, that's the worst as well. You're like, oh yes, I've definitely got this. This is cool. And you're panicking massively inside. So yeah, we've all been there. And I suppose as someone interviewing people, I go between what's the best thing to do for people, because I have come to enjoy that task when you don't know anything about it. And I think that has come from years of putting together presentations that, you know, like you said, Sarah, you spend days doing it, and then you put so much time and effort, and you would pay a freelancer quite a lot of money to do that sort of work, and you've done it for free, and then you don't get the job. So I've started to prefer a sort of, you know, quick thinking just before the interview, you know, just get it all down on paper kind of task. But one little tip that I wanted to share was, if I am doing a presentation, what I found good, I've taken handouts in the past to give to the panel. Just, it doesn't have, don't just print out your presentation and give it to them. I mean, like a little handout that sort of summarizes your key points, and then they can keep that, and hopefully they can scribble on it, or they can just, it can be like a little memento of you after you've left the room. And I've found that that's worked a couple of times, so you might want to think about doing that if you've got loads of time to prepare and a printer.
James?
Yeah, I would agree with Laura on that one. I actually don't do presentations, or rather I never use PowerPoint for presentations in interviews. And often the feedback I've got is that I was the only one who didn't use PowerPoint, and sometimes they find that refreshing. If you're doing a 5-minute talk, how many slides are you generally going to need in 5 minutes? So really think, does the topic need illustrating? And actually, if I'm doing a presentation, I just do the presentation and give them it on paper, obviously current times, but that way they've got your presentation, and if your tech goes down, you don't need to worry that you haven't got your presentation because they've already got it in front of you. So always good to be prepared, especially for smaller organisations where the tech is not always as reliable as you might like.
Nobody ever wants to rely on the tech.
Just quickly, Tom, I've led recruitment days in the past where there's been sort of 30 people in the room at once, and then there's been skills-based activities and team working throughout the course of the day, and that's really interesting. And I'd just say, if you do get anything a bit like that, with all of these things, actually, it's just about looking at who are they looking for and what are they looking for. So obviously, if you're going for a serious leadership role, if you're on a recruitment day, you need to show leadership. It's not sort of rocket science in that way. But if you're not, if you're going for a team player role, you need to be careful about how much leadership you show. And also remember, when you're nervous, you can end up, and I'm a massive victim of this, talking way too much. In fact, I just talk too much, whatever the story. So, in that environment, you don't want someone who talks over other people, who completely dominates. But then equally, you don't want someone who says nothing, because if you're being interviewed the whole time, you need to be able to shine, but shine appropriately. So it's always about linking back to, with integrity, because you don't want to be someone you're not in any of these situations, so then the job won't be right. But link it back to what the interviewer wants to see.
I would just add to that. Remember that everyone you meet on the day may be involved in the interview or may be asked about it, especially if they've arranged, say, a tour with volunteers or something like that. They might not be on the panel, but they might be asked to give their feedback. So I've had candidates who've been great in the interview, but have treated the volunteer like dirt. And, in a heavily volunteer-led organisation, that's not the kind of person we were looking to recruit. So do remember that you are being judged by everyone.
Absolutely. And I would say for my interview for my current role, the tour was actually led by the person who would be my direct report. So I think it was even more pertinent in that instance. We're a bit tight for time, so I'm going to try and move on quickly. What should you wear, and should you take in anything with you? And this relates to a question I've seen in the chat about whether or not it's okay to take notes into an interview. Would anybody like to start on that?
Yes, take notes in if it makes you feel better. Like, don't read them, obviously, as in like don't read them. But yeah, as I think it was Sarah had the brilliant example about those. It's all about evidence and examples, and it is those that go out of your head in the moment, and you end up waffling about how great X is, when actually what you want to do is give an example of when you've done X. And particularly when you're looking, in my field of development, there's a lot of figures there, and they'll ask you, when did you get your £1 million gift, and who is it from, or these kind of questions. Then sometimes you kind of think, what was my budget when I worked there? And the last thing you want to do is contradict your CV. So I always take in and neatly, not like in a sort of massive messy papers, because then you'll get confused, but have the CV, have a marked up copy of the JD there with examples next to the key points. And wear, I would say, you know, be yourself, be comfortable, because if you're dressed as what you think they want you to be, you won't be comfortable. But, you know, maybe consider wearing something stand out, you know, so they can, you know, they're remembering back, you know, the bloke in the pink shirt or the girl in the red top, whatever. I actually had feedback after an interview that I'd got that they noticed my shoes in the interview. They felt that they were quirky but sensible, and it was a national. I tell you, it was a national trust. And I think they liked the fact that I hadn't sort of gone teetering in heels that I couldn't walk in, because they knew that I'd be walking across muddy fields and up historic staircases. So interviewers do notice funny things sometimes.
I think one of the challenges I have is knowing whether or not to wear a tie.
I thought you were going to say heels then, Tom. I thought you I thought you were literally deadpan going to say.
Well, you know, maybe increasing the stature would have an impact on the panel in terms of how you perceive you. Who knows these things? We also had a question about whether or not you should cover up tattoos. And I think it's dreadful that people would discriminate against people with tattoos. And maybe if you did cover it up, you would protect yourself from being victim of that discrimination, but only in that one instance. And I think you'd have to ask yourself longer term, would you be happy to work for an institution that's got those sorts of attitudes? But did anybody else have anything to add to what you should wear or take in with you? Laura Crossley.
Yeah, I would say also really consider taking in a portfolio, like whether you're in a sort of creative part of museums or not. I've taken in before like posters of events that I've done, print out of websites, you know, leaflets, and anything I can find that shows what I've done, because firstly, I think it helps give you confidence, a bit like Lucy was saying, you know that you've got examples you can draw on, but you can also say, and this is exactly what I did, and even like consider maybe making a handout of the things that you've done to hand to the panel. I don't think you can ever kind of give the panel too much. I think it's a really good idea to kind of be as prepared as possible. And in terms of what you wear, I would echo, you know, something you feel comfortable in. It's really interesting. I was on an interview panel at the National Trust, and my colleague partly went for someone because they weren't in heels. So clearly, if you're going to go for an interview for the National Trust, then don't wear heels. That's the best piece of advice I can give. But I did wear heels for my National Trust interview, and I got the job. So I don't know. But yeah, something you feel confident in and something that shows it's you. I think, as Tom said, why work for an organisation that won't accept you as you are?
Yeah, totally. I don't think I've ever given a job or not given a job considering on what someone was wearing. I think that, you know, if someone comes in the suit, brilliant. You know, if someone's showing me, yeah, I think your point about the tattoos was a really good point. And I was just going to say about taking things in. Yeah, I definitely have taken like a notebook before where I've got my notes, and if someone asks me a question and I just can't think of it, I say, oh, I've prepared that question, can I just have a look, you know, a check at my notes? And also, I don't think there's anything wrong with taking a notebook to write down the questions, because some people have an awful propensity to have a really, really long question with, you know, 3 or 4 points in that question. And if someone's just taking notes of, you know, what that is absolutely fine with me. Not marking them down at all on that. So if you need that to prompt you as you go through your answer, that's fine.
One other thing that I think inexperienced candidates often worry about is curveball questions. If you're an animal, what sort of animal would you be? In the panel's experience, do curveball questions even exist in the museum industry?
Yes. No,
sorry,
I've just got no. You go, James.
If we go to him and then over to you next, Laura.
I was going to disagree and say I've never come across a curveball question, but one thing that I've tripped candidates up with, not on purpose, but has been difficult, is hypothetical questions. Often, you know, I'll take a real example, especially when I was front of house. You know, the mother of the bride hangs a hat on a statue during the middle of a wedding speech. What do you do? Which has happened to me. And that often catches people out. Partly that's one of the reasons why I like to run it, because it sees how people think on their feet. But it does, but unless if that's a requirement for the job, that's obviously a good reason to ask it. But yeah, hypotheticals. I've never had, if you were a biscuit, what type of biscuit? But it is one that I know exists, but haven't come across.
Laura.
Yeah, I've just got a really ridiculous one, which is like one of my favourite. I mean, it was awful at the time. Quite a large garden here in London asked me what my best plant-based experience was. I just couldn't. I had literally nothing.
I think for many of us that would be very difficult to answer.
Well, yeah, I had literally nothing to say. And I've got to say, I've not really experienced that anywhere else. And I don't think there's much that you can do. And to be honest, I sort of judged them for asking me that. But yeah, they do happen. And I think all you can do, like James said, is just think on your feet. That's all you can do. You can't prepare for them. Don't spend hours thinking about what animal you'd be or what your best plant-based experience was. Like that's pointless.
No,
Sarah.
Sorry.
I would just say don't be panicked afterwards. Don't think it's going to lose you the job because you didn't say you're a jammy dodger. Like it's meant to try and get your personality out, but it doesn't really work. I think it's rubbish. These questions, what's your favourite plant-based experience in the office? Yeah, maybe you'd come up with something. But in an unusual setting where you're trying to remember everything that you've got to remember, you've got these people staring at you, don't afterwards be thrown off, because I think I've had it once, I can't remember what it was, blacked it out, and my next questions were bad, because in my head I was like, oh, I didn't answer that question, they're not going to hire me, and that's not really the reality. So just don't let them throw you off.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'd add that I've never received a curveball question, and I don't think they're necessarily that helpful unless you actually need the skill of being able to think on your feet, which is not appropriate a lot of the time in this industry. So yeah, interesting to hear your reflections on it though. I think one more question, then we'll try and go over to the Q. Oh, two more questions in Q&A. Questions for the panel. How important are these, and do you have any good examples? If I have a hand, Lucy.
These are my, as an interviewee, this is my, as an interviewer, sorry, these are my favourite bit of the interview. And what I would say is, no thank you, I think you've said everything. To me, as an interviewer, says they're not interested. So that's one to definitely avoid. How many days holiday do I get? That's also one that's like a massive no. You can ask that afterwards. It's not a deal breaker. But there are so many brilliant questions and you can prepare these in advance, because this bit of the interview you have control. And interviews are or should be absolutely two-way. Now that's probably difficult to kind of remember if you've had a number of interviews in a row and you're not having much luck. But interviews should be absolutely two-way. You are going there to find out whether you want to work there as well. And actually links to the curveball questions. If they were asking you a genuinely curveball question to trip you up, is that somewhere you want to be? Is that someone you want to work for? But it's an opportunity to find out about the culture of the organisation. Ask them, what is the culture of the organisation? What's your approach to wellbeing? What's your approach to diversity? What's your approach to inclusion? And what's your approach to the environment? You can ask them about yourself and your own opportunities there. What do you think? How would you try and develop me? What other opportunities will there be for me in this organisation? But also you can be really precise. You can show your ambition. I want to be a CEO in 5 years' time. How are you going to help me get there if I get this job? You can ask about the panellists. You can say, what do you love most about working here? Where do you see yourself going in the organisation? Which sounds a bit like how long you're going to move on and I might get promoted. But also you can, if you feel it's gone well and you think, okay, I feel like it's gone well now, you can say to them, what do you think my strengths are? Why did you pick me for interview? And actually, because what you're doing is drawing out of them, they're going, actually, I do quite like this person. What are her strengths or what are his strengths? And then they're actually been asked to verbalise them. And the converse of that, you can say, which of the areas do you think that I'll have to be, you'll have to support me in more if I was to get this job? Or where do you think the areas I need to work on if I'm to get this job? So the opportunities for that section are limitless. So I would say, always say, oh, I've got absolutely loads for you. I don't quite know where to start, but can I just start by asking, what do you love about working here? Because then hopefully they're not like thrown off and going, oh, it's a terrible place to work. So kind of remember that you're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you. and enjoy that bit, shine in that bit if you found yourself nervous in the rest of it.
James, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to agree with everything that Lucy said there. Is it your chance to interview them? What I would say is if they don't offer you a free chance, we usually end each interview is there anything we haven't asked about that you'd like to tell us about? If they don't ask you a question like that and there's something that you feel is quite important that they haven't asked about, it can be, would you mind if I told you about this project I did, or could I add something about this? Or if you've remembered something from a previous question that you should have covered, you say, I didn't say about this project. Could I go back to question 2 and just add an answer? Because it's a really good opportunity for you to just fill in blanks and not leave feeling you've left something on the table.
Laura, Crossley.
I would echo everything that's been said already, but I'd also say this is where taking in notes can be really helpful, because by the time you've got to an end of the interview, you can be absolutely exhausted. You've kept all this information in your head that you're trying to tell the panellists, and sometimes they say questions and it's just your mind goes completely blank. So I always write down my questions, and if my mind goes blank, I can then just read them out, and it shows the panellists that I have been thinking about it. And I'd say as well, like in all the research you do about the job before putting in your application form and then before the interview, hopefully natural questions will come up. So I think, you really use it as an opportunity to show that you're curious about the organisation, you're curious about the job, you want to get a job that really fits your values and where you're heading. And I think that comes across really well to the panel.
Mm-hmm. I would say also write down a good number of questions, because a few of them will inevitably be answered during the course of the interview itself, and you don't want to be left with nothing at all. Failure, not getting the job, obviously disappointing, crushing sometimes, but how can you turn it into a positive? Sarah?
First of all, you've got to realise that you're allowed to feel sad when you don't get a job. You've not only put the effort in to apply, you've practiced for your interview, you've imagined yourself in that role, you're going to be good at it, you've imagined you moving, what your personal life, so all this is now being stripped away from you, so you're essentially grieving for something that you didn't have. So first of all, let yourself just deal with that, because that's the healthiest thing you can do. And then just remember, every time you have an interview, you're one step closer. I went through so many interviews to get one job, and then once I got one job, suddenly I was going through less interviews for the next job. It's a long game working in heritage, and unfortunately you're not going to get right up to the top straight away, but every time you do an interview you are taking a step closer, and it's going to get easier.
I think that's very true. And I think it gets easier because a lot of the questions that are asked are very similar, as we sort of touched upon at the start of the session. And that's why I always recommend writing down all of the questions as soon as you possibly can when you come out of an interview, and then just keep that in a bank for the next one that comes up. James, did you have your hand up?
Is that for me?
Did you have your hand up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Feedback. Ask for feedback, take the feedback, don't take it to heart if the feedback is not always the most useful, but some places will specifically say we will not give feedback, but unless they specifically say that, ask for it and take it. The last interview round I did was we had 55 applicants for a single post, of whom 50 were interviewable. So we interviewed 6 and 1 got it. And I think 4 out of the 5 who didn't get it, the feedback was very, very, I felt like I was splitting hairs on a lot of them because they were all fantastic. It's the position we're in at the moment. There's a lot of people looking for jobs. It might just not be your day. The feedback might end up being very minimal, but every little bit of feedback, there might be a little nugget in there that you can incorporate into your next one. If you didn't do quite as well on a question, remember that for next time, write that down in your notes. But try and get feedback if at all possible. And you can reflect on your own performance as well. Think back afterwards, think about each question. Did you feel happy with your response? Was there something, now you've had time to analyse it, that you wish you'd said? Write it down, remember it for next time.
Yeah, writing down things is always good, I think. Laura, Southall.
Just really quickly, we've got a session on feedback on Wednesday, I believe. So if anyone wants to hear more about that, but I'm totally an advocate, always try and get feedback. I know it's hard to hear sometimes, but it's always worth trying to do that. And if you can, if someone is offering to do that on the phone or in person with you, I would take that opportunity. It might be awkward, you might feel shit afterwards, excuse my language, but it's worth doing. And I guess also on failure, oh my gosh, I've been to so many interviews and had a period of about 6 months where I was doing an interview every few weeks and just getting turned down and turned down and turned down. And I will say, from a sort of now distance position, this sounds very cheesy, but it's kind of meant to be sometimes when you get turned down for a job. Sometimes you can't see that. And there are a couple of jobs in there where I still do not understand why I didn't get it. It seemed perfect. But I think when you do get the job that you end up getting, you realise why you got given that job and not given some of the other jobs. And it's always worth thinking about that when you do get the job in the end. And yeah, you've all said it, you know, you've got to go through all of that thing, but all the practice is worthwhile. And there often is, if you can look really openly and honestly at your experiences, there usually is a reason why you didn't get it, and that's okay. You know, that's absolutely fine. That is natural. That is fine.
Laura Crossley, quickly if we could, because time is
just do a sentence. I'll just say also, don't just see it as your failure. Like, there are lots and lots of reasons people don't get jobs. I was absolutely heartbroken after not getting a job a couple of years ago, and actually realised, you know what, I just put so much pressure on myself to get that job. It was like my absolute dream job. And probably the amount of pressure I put on myself meant that I didn't get it, because in the interview I was just so nervous. So it's not your failure, it's just that job wasn't meant to be. And as Laura said, it's very hard to see that in the moment, very, very difficult. But it will happen. Just, I think, kind of just keep going and don't let one bad interview experience completely cloud the others. Make sure you go into your next interview with a clean slate and think, right, this time it's going to be, you know, okay, and you're going to do your best. All anyone can do is their best. Don't put too much pressure on yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing I think we really should discuss is interviewing over Zoom or Teams or any other platform like that, which obviously since COVID is a much more common technique. Do any of the panel have any experience of this, and any practical tips about how to manage remote interviewing? James?
The last round we ran was a Zoom-only interview. Honestly, from the panel side, it didn't feel too much different. I mean, it was odd that they weren't in front of us rather than on a screen, but we managed to get the tech to work. I think it was harder being on the other side. I'm lucky that I haven't had to be on the other side. I guess set it up as if it is an interview, get yourself a glass of water, have your notes, treat it as if you were sitting in front of them, and put yourself in the right headspace for it would be my suggestion.
But you don't have to worry about the shoe conundrum, so that's good. You can be wearing socks, and also that thing that sometimes people tell you if you're nervous to picture the people naked or something. You can picture the people, because I wear slippers and pajama bottoms when I'm interviewing people on Zoom, so you can picture people in that context, so that might help a bit.
I think you could come back to whatever makes you feel comfortable as well, because sometimes I dress up smartly when I'm working from home because I feel that it might be a boost to productivity. But equally, if I want to be relaxed, then I want to wear something a bit more comfortable that doesn't have a horrible waistband that cuts into my ever-growing rotundness. Laura Crossley.
To say, I'm actually doing some interviews on Friday via Zoom, so I might have other things to say then. But I would say, firstly, as a freelancer, I did quite a lot of remote interviews because it wasn't always worth organisations getting us to travel all across the country. So one thing, I always have my notes next to me. The interviewers can't see that you've got notes, so I'd have way more notes next to me than I'd normally take into an interview, which actually made me feel really good. You can, exactly, Sarah, you can sometimes have notes open on your laptop as well. So you can have notes everywhere that you can refer to. And yeah, I'd just say make sure you have like the interviewer's number as well. We've been saying this to the people we're interviewing on Friday. So we all know that Zoom can suddenly go wrong, or we can lose our internet connection, and that can be a bit frightening. So make sure there's someone that you can call and let them know if you're having problems, because it's absolutely fine. Everyone understands that there can be technical issues, but just make sure you've got someone that you can tell about it.
I think having several lines of communication is always a good idea, and practice tethering whatever devices you've got to your phone to use its data if your Wi-Fi goes down. That's helped me out of a scrape as well, but it's not something you want to do sort of on the hoof, so to speak. I don't know if this counts as a curveball question, but what is your biggest weakness? It's one that I've had come up before, definitely. So do any of you have any suggestions about how to answer that one?
Yeah, I can go, Tom, if you want. I think
Please,
I've often been asked what are my 3 sort of positive attributes and my 3 weaknesses. I would say, you know, again, it's about keeping it really relevant to the organisation and the role, because they don't want to hear that you're rubbish at housework. You know, that would be mine probably, or whatever. Neither do they want to hear really that you're bad at timekeeping or any of those, or I'm bad at getting on with people. You know, they don't, when they ask for honesty, you know, you've got to be a bit selective, and actually you can turn it around. So for example, if the role was, you know, requires quite a lot of detail, then perhaps that you're a perfectionist could be a negative. I mean, you know, it's not really. Or I'll be honest, one of the ones I've used before is, you know, that I can be really bad at sticking to like a 9 to 5. I just, you know, I can find myself getting so passionately involved in a role that I just, you know, want to work at it all hours. I mean, not phrased quite as cheesily as that, but I think you can turn your negatives and challenges into things that actually, you know, they're phrased as negatives, but they've got 2 sides to that coin, because you don't really want to give away massive weaknesses. You want to kind of frame them in a way that really could be positives, I would say, without being in any way dishonest.
James?
Don't humble brag. Don't say, oh, my biggest weakness is I work too hard. We see right through that one. Generally, my advice would be to look at the job description. It's a shopping list. They don't expect you to have everything, and there will be almost certainly one thing on there at least that you've not got as much experience in, even if you've got some. So mine is, I came through front of house, so I don't have as much experience on the curatorial side of things. So I say that. I don't have as much experience as curator, but I've done X, Y, and Z to help me overcome this. I'm never going to be a curator. It's not what I do, but I've shown how I've tried to minimise that weakness. And I think for me, that's the best one. It shows self-awareness, and it shows that you're willing to put the graft in.
I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, just pick something you've actively worked to try and develop. But when it's me, I always pick a weakness that's not a massive one. So you don't want to be reflected poorly. We've got a question about having an interview at an organisation you already work at. And I think that also, to a lot of people, would apply to organisations you already volunteer at. Would you handle those interviews any differently?
No, I would. It's difficult, but I would go into it and treat it as if they're strangers. I mean, obviously you can have a bit of chatter beforehand, but especially if they're grid marking, where you get 10 points if you say the right things on the piece of paper. If you assume that they know something about you, they won't mark that on the paper because you didn't say it, and it can feel quite harsh. But treat it as if it's an external interview. Make sure you write the application and write in it what your job is, even if they all 3 people on the panel know it, because it gives them the best chance to score you highest.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also say it's maybe even more important at that point to think about your, not weaknesses, but where you might need developing, because that may be, depends how often you've worked with them, that may be already in their head, and you can't change that, but you can acknowledge it, and you can talk about how you might want to improve that, how you've already done things that they may not know about to counteract those development needs. So I think being quite open and honest about that is good, rather than just thinking, oh, they know about that, so I'm not going to mention it. And I think also, you know, especially for people that have worked in the same organisation for a really long time, absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I think going back to what I said before about thinking about external examples that you've seen, I think an interview panel might want to just know that you just haven't worked there for a really long time and you've never thought about anywhere else. I think having a bit of awareness, if you've got some examples of best practice you've seen elsewhere and you've put into your role, excellent. If you've got a volunteer role, if you're a trustee outside of your work, if you're a governor, you know, if you had a job before this, it's nice to mention that and weave that in. I think you need to do a little bit of effort to show that you're not just about that organisation.
Some really great questions coming up in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we won't have time to answer them all. Somebody's raised the issue of questions being issued in advance, and I absolutely think this is the future of interviews. Do the panel have any thoughts on that at all?
Never come across that.
No, it's never happened. I've never done that, but I can totally see the benefit of it, and I would quite welcome that approach, actually. Maybe not absolutely all of them. What I am really enjoying is some places now, rather than say just write a personal statement, get on with it, and there's no sort of structure to that, there's no word count, you've got no, in your head you know that you shouldn't go over 2 pages, but you've got loads to say and you get carried away. I've seen a couple of organisations that ask you for sort of say 500 words about a particular thing that relates to that. So for my job at the Science Museum, it was 500 words on how you manage people, 500 words on something else, 500 words on something else, rather than a personal statement, and that is so helpful. That was really good. So at the very least, I think we could move to that, but it would be nice if we could give a bit more, in some contexts, I think a bit more of those questions up front. I think that would be good. Yeah,
I think it's something we'll see more and more of moving forward, even if it's relatively rare at the moment. And I also think giving as much guidance to candidates prior to an interview or an application process is really important, because not everybody has the same experience of that. We've got about 90 seconds left, so if anybody has anything that they really want to say. Sarah?
We get transcripts of some of these chats, because I've just been trying to follow on. There's a few that I feel like I could answer later on. Some that I have no experience in, but
so I believe the transcripts are being recorded. Laura, Crossley.
I also think, I know this has been about like how to be a really good interviewee, but I do think there's something about how to be a good interviewer as well, and we could all remember that throughout our careers, like how to make a nice, friendly environment. So don't try and ask those trick questions. Do whatever we can to get the best out of interviewees, I think is really, really important. I think it does work both ways. A good interviewee will be better because of a good interviewer.
Absolutely. James?
Just very quickly, trust your gut. If you go to an interview and you think the place is going to be awful, don't work there. My worst experience, I should have trusted myself, and I didn't, and I worked there, and it was the worst experience of my life. And if it's not for you, no matter how much you want the job, it will not be good for you.
About 15 seconds for anybody else. Lucy?
There's obviously over 100 questions. I was just going to say I love interviews. If anybody wants, if you want to distribute emails, I'd be more than happy to talk to people or answer questions offline.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Tweet me, whatever. More than happy to have a chat.
I think if people want to contact FMJ, then we can get in contact with you. But please do so after this week, because we're a bit busy until Sunday. So. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the panel as well for a really interesting discussion.